Well, thanks very much for coming out. Thanks for inviting me. As Betty said, I'm going to be talking about some of the politics surrounding cultural policymaking, but specifically, I'm going to look at the importance of political, institutional, and economic factors and how they shape the policymaking context for the cultural economy. When I'm talking about the cultural economy, I think it's a broad term that's familiar to many, but just to clarify, we're talking about visual and performing arts. We're talking about design and media-based industries like film and music. I think this term is often used interchangeably with creative economy. Cities often will use this creativity label, which can get even bigger than this, but I want to stake out my terrain in the beginning. I'm focusing on this too because, as many of you are probably aware, the last 10, 15 years we've seen such an explosion of arts-based economic development in so many cities in the US and elsewhere. But more specifically for my work in planning and geography, where I'm located and do much of my work, is there's been such a huge outpouring of literature that is looking at the functional dynamics of the cultural sectors. So why does film locate in Hollywood? Why does fashion cluster in New York? What's the dynamic between businesses that makes this cluster work? What are the benefits from people working in this cluster? These are really important questions, and they give you ideas where you want to go for policy, but they're not looking at that big context, that big sort of policy framework, and that's where I'm going to take my talk today. So my basic goal is to come up with lessons for thinking about that framework for policy. Two key questions are guiding my work and where I'm going with this today is, first of all, what are the key variables that influence cultural policy over time? And secondly, another question couched within that, how do cultural sector coalitions interact and attempt to influence policy? And here, when I use the phrase cultural sector coalition, I'm essentially just talking about an alliance of arts and cultural interests in the public, private, and nonprofit sectors that are working together on a sort of common benefits and issues. So let me give you a little bit of framework on the case that I'll go into. And today I'll primarily be talking about Austin, Texas, where I've done a lot of this work, and at the end I'll bring up some other places as well. First of all, I think the common narrative that is probably, again, familiar to many in the room is that last 10 years we've seen the rise of this creative city, creative class idea promoted by Richard Florida's work in particular that says the arts are an amenity. They can attract highly skilled, highly educated individuals, the creative class, and it helps to serve as an amenity for redevelopment. There's been a lot of case study work on this that shows how cities are applying this idea. And very interesting and powerful critiques of the creative city sort of discourse. But I think there's something missing from a lot of the work that I've been reading and looking at, and in particular, three key areas that I focus on here. First of all is thinking about the creative city as a window of opportunity. And so what I mean by that is that part of this dominant narrative of the creative city and creative class redevelopment is that it comes out sort of like a traditional growth machine or urban regime dynamic where you have a coalition of elites united around property development and pushing this interest on their behalf. And when you do it in the arts and culture framework, then part of this growth machine then becomes the large cultural institutions, arts organizations. They get brought into this redevelopment dynamic as well. But what I think we might also find is looking at this concept and manipulating it in different ways. So like as a window of opportunity for alternative interests to use this concept to push for a different creative city agenda. At the same time, I think we'd likely see an internal diversity in cultural sector work. The different identities between a musician, between a dancer, or another performer, or someone that works in the film industry. Well, there's a lot in common between these different people that work in these fields. I think there's some differences that could come out as well, something to think about. And then finally, in looking at this idea that these creative class amenities-based policies are implemented in city after city, I would argue that cities aren't necessarily overhauling or getting rid of their old policies and all of a sudden instituting a new amenities-based approach, but rather we're going to see an evolution of policy that builds up over a few decades, and that this is part of the policy story. And so, especially when I focus on this Austin case, I'm looking at this bigger story. And so, the framework that really helps me think about this in this way is from literature on institutions and institutionalism. And I'll just give a very brief overview of it here. But when I'm talking about institutions, I'm looking at this combination of informal rules, tacit agreements between actors in a policy field, combined with the formal agreements, the formal regulations through which policymaking has to go through. At the same time, quite often you see a path dependency in policy. Places get locked in, cultural policy or otherwise. Places get locked into the same policy, moving in one direction, a path dependence. And any kind of changes are going to be built on this institutional inheritance of policy over time. Of course, people with the material resources, the finances, the money to push policy in a certain direction have power, but symbolic resources matter too. So you think about this creative class idea. It's been really powerful for some places as an economic imaginary to push certain policy ideas forward. And while policies are set in place over a long period often, there's also room for path-shaping strategies. So crises, key events, key documents that can shift the direction of policy. And in the process then, this policy field becomes a site of conflict. And so this institutional and political context matters in terms of how the players can manipulate the direction of policy. So this is my framework for thinking about Austin from the 1980s to the present. I chose Austin because, first of all, it's a place that really put early emphasis on arts and culture in terms of economic development. Secondly, it's crowned itself the live music capital of the world. It's renowned for its music industry. It has high levels of employment in music and some arts and design occupations. And the music scene, I think, has been established for a number of decades, and it's a fairly eclectic one. And then finally, the city maintains multiple agencies and programs for pushing cultural economic development. It's not just in their cultural affairs office, but you have programs spread throughout the Parks Department and Visitors Bureau and so forth. And so ultimately, I think that I look at Austin because this is a place where this idea of arts and culture as an economic development tool matters. So it gives me, and over a long period of time, so it gives me a chance to look at this in depth. Very, very brief on the methods. I looked at an array of plans from the mayor's office, economic development, cultural affairs, and so forth. Not at all representative of what I have up on the screen. And quite a few interviews with directors and staff of a variety of different public level agencies, people in arts organizations that worked on cultural planning, representatives of the music industry, the authors of these policy reports, and trying to piece together the evolution of cultural economy policy over time in the city, trying to get a sense of the organizational framework, these sort of institutional battles that go on, and think about how the different actors are defining this field. So the case study, I've broken down into 3 key time periods. And this first one really sort of sets the stage, the institutional inheritance for cultural economy policy in Austin. It's defined by 3 key issues. This attention to cultural amenities, the recognition of the music scene in the city, and an early split between the commercial music sector and a nonprofit arts sector. So here's sort of how this early history plays out. And it's a number of key things that happen right around 85, 86. First of all, in the early 80s, you look at Austin. Today, it's well renowned for its high-tech economy. In the early 80s, it really didn't have much of any tech development to speak of. It had some branch manufacturing plants, but not much going on. And in around 85, a coalition was formed to promote high-tech development through the city, the Chamber of Commerce, and local business interests. And they had this 3-pronged strategy to promote tech development and try to get more R&D, research and development in the city. And this consisted of investing in the science and engineering departments in UT, University of Texas, incentivizing tax abatements and other incentives for trying to get research and development consortiums and research and development activity in the city. And then thirdly, an emphasis on environmental and cultural amenities. So early on, a key part of the strategy was promoting particularly the sort of quality of life in Austin as an amenity, and in some sense, a little bit later on music and a little bit arts. But this vague idea that Austin has a unique quality of life and its cultural character will attract tech development. So over that next decade, 85, 86 to the middle, late 90s, explosion in tech development, whether or not it's related to this strategy or not, but it happened. You have Dell comes in and a number of other small firms and firms of various sizes. By 97, the employment base in Austin is comprised of 20% tech, so 20% of the employed population work in high-tech industries. And along with this comes a huge population growth. And so the city's really worrying about what's happening to our quality of life here. What's happening to the hill country, our environment around us, so because they're seeing the city sprawl and getting bigger and bigger. They already have some watershed protection acts in place, but they don't really have a solid growth management tool. And so it's at this time, to thinking about the population pressures, that the city develops a new smart growth program. And again, arts as an amenity, cultural amenities come into play a role here. And they do so in a couple of ways. First of all, they have what's shown on the map here are a set of desired development zones. Try to slow peripheral expansion and get development into the core. One of the things they do is offer smart growth incentives. A key part of this incentive is to evaluate a firm on whether or not they're going to get abatements or any kind of benefits from the city is, do they contribute to cultural vitality? Do they contribute to Austin's cultural vitality? Another important program was the Austin Sense of Place and Cultural Identity program. This was the idea that they were going to focus on using public art and streetscape improvements and similar sorts of aesthetic design elements to attract development into the desired development zone. So again, arts as an amenity to promote development from the early 80s onward. Another thing going on at this time is the awakening to the music scene in Austin. Again, early 80s, city leaders, the Chamber of Commerce, when they tried to promote tech development, they thought about economic development and they thought about music. They saw the hordes of students at UT campus, it's a giant school, descending on downtown on the weekends and drinking. And so this was a bar scene. I mean, they saw music as a bar scene, or they saw it as, punks and hippies, and it's just not something that's going to help tech. But with this, when this tech-focused coalition comes together, especially from people in the chamber, they say, well, wait a second. Live music is an important part of Austin's quality of life, and we should promote this. And so this is a sort of change in thinking from something of a bar scene and a stigma to a live music scene. And so subsequent to this, the city invests in music. They create a music commission to advise the city on music-related issues. They enact a music loan guarantee program to back loans for musicians and music-related businesses. And by 91, they crown themselves live music capital of the world. So all this is going on too, is the final point here, totally separate from everything else. Again, it's 85, 86. The city ramps up its investments in the arts. And these are, for the time, I think, fairly conventional arts programs. They already had a program that funded local arts and arts organizations called cultural contracts. But on top of this, they create a percent for public art program. They passed a bond for new cultural facilities that would fund new cultural institutions in the center of the city. And they formed their first cultural affairs division, which they housed in the Parks Department. And the cultural affairs division was going to oversee all of this activity and also handle arts education programs. And this really wasn't a part of this tech imagination here. So what you, again, just to reinforce that this is more of a nonprofit arts focus. On the other hand, is music developing as a sector that is an economic driver and important for the city's image. And so 93, the city has its first arts plan that really reinforces this. They focus on audience development, arts education. The only kind of economic development efforts for the arts are related to tourism. So with this context, there's another period of change around 2002, 2003. And this is coming on the heels of the dot-com bust. It hits Austin especially hard because they have employment so heavily concentrated in tech. And the mayor at the time wants to find a way out of this problem, diversify the economy, and so he institutes the Mayor's Task Force on the Economy in 2003, publishes a really important report in the following year. And the task force is essentially comprised of 3 subcommittees. One is traditional businesses, which at this time now is really high-tech development. 2, small business, and 3, cultural vitality in the creative economy. These are 3 areas that are seen as the lead economic drivers for the city, and that's why they're included. Ultimately, these are bundled together with the city's existing redevelopment agency under a brand new economic development office called the Economic Growth and Redevelopment Services Office. And so the Cultural Arts Division has moved from parks into economic development with this direct economic development charge. It leaves behind the facilities management, the arts education to the Parks Department, and it's taking on more, it's still looking at public art, cultural contracts, but it's also looking at the film and music industry. They're taking over the music programs now. Second factor, audit of the cultural funding program, 2002, the same exact time period. The program is found to be poorly mismanaged. The arts plan's never been implemented, and the audit basically says, you need to restructure everything that's going on. They push for this move into economic development. They call for a community cultural planning process to be handled, implemented, and they hire a new director of cultural affairs right at this time to really oversee the restructuring and of the funding program. The final major factor during this early 2000s period is the publication of Richard Florida's book, Rise of the Creative Class. But what's important, and I think very interesting to emphasize here, is this isn't a case of a city discovering Florida's ideas, latching onto them, and trying to implement them. Florida had been visiting Austin many times previous to this. People in the city are very familiar with his work and vice versa. And actually, Florida really learned a lot of his ideas from what Austin was already doing, from what I've already described in this amenities-based approach. And so what Florida did for Austin, though, was gave them a new language. So no longer does the city talk about arts and culture. They begin to talk about creativity. They have a new economic development target. It's not high tech, it's attracting the creative class, it's creative industries. And so along with this, they develop and expand their existing programs. The Music Loan Guarantee Program becomes the Creative Industries Loan Guarantee Program. They're trying to broaden it. They create a new staff position, Creative Industries Development Manager. They have new programs that sort of promote the music image, like live music at city council meetings and at the airport. More amenities-based activity for downtown. So reinforcing what the Austin Sense of Place program did with increasing the percentage for public art, most public arts downtown, another cultural facilities bond, and really just, again, this overall emphasis on looking at the smart growth strategy now as also a creative class strategy. So if we can attract the creative class downtown, we're implementing smart growth. And this starts to have a backlash in the city because Austin really recovered fairly rapidly from the dot-com bust. And the period of the 2000s was one of major redevelopment in the core. And there's a lot of talk and the pressure it's putting on artists and cultural workers in terms of displacing them from the center of the city. And the argument here is, you rely on us for your quality of life, your arts amenities strategy, and now we're getting kicked out of the city. And so it's within this context that the city embarks on its first cultural plan since '93. Create Austin is a 10-year cultural plan. The planning process was initiated in 2006. It was completed in 2008 in just under 2 years. And it does a few important things in terms of cultural economic development. On the one hand, it reinforces everything the city's doing. It's lauding the city's emphasis on arts as an amenity and the emphasis on image to attract development. And it's really latching on to the Florida's language of creativity and the creative class. But at the same time, it's using this language to try to change the framework, change that institutional context, if you will. So a lot of what's coming in the plan is using this language to redirect attention to direct support for a creative workforce, if you will. They do this in a few different ways. One, through the planning process. It's a very open planning process where there are a number of community meetings and forums and a survey to try to not only get feedback on the plan, but bring people working in the arts and cultural sectors together. They create a leadership task force for the plan, which is comprised of 70 people from the arts and cultural community, local businesses, people from the university, and so forth. And put together a set of recommendations that, to be frank, is really quite long. There are about 36 recommendations, but they highlight 3 up at the front. And these really focus on representation. So putting together a leadership task force to oversee implementation of the plan. Focusing on the development of a creative alliance, which is essentially a way to market and promote Create Austin, but also a place where people working in these arts fields can sort of meet and come together, share ideas, network, and so forth. And then finally, and most importantly, they call for a separate Department of Arts and Culture, which they later dub Creative Enterprises. So they want to move out of economic development, consolidate all the programs around the city, and consolidate the funding. Another important thing that the plan does is latch onto this gentrification issue and reframe this idea of smart growth and redevelopment as a threat to the quality of life, a threat to the people that are making Austin distinctive and that are driving the economic development strategy that the city has in place. So what happens to the plan? It's completed in 2008, but it is actually not approved for 2 years. It's not approved until 2010. It's only partially approved, and there's no new funding put towards the plan. In the interim, the 2008-2010 period, the Cultural Arts Division does try to implement some aspects of the plan. So they start their Creative Alliance. They hold technical assistance workshops. They get some money from the NEA and the Texas Commission on the Arts to do this. And they're trying to get the plan going on their own. But ultimately, the city doesn't support it. The city that invests so much attention on the arts and culture as part of their image and music is not supporting this plan. It's really has not wholeheartedly been supported. And so identify here 5 factors that I think help to explain why this happened. First is the leaders of the planning process did not do an adequate job of establishing solid political linkages. They had as their honorary mayor, the honorary chairman of the leadership task force was a former mayor. They had a couple of former city council members on the leadership task force of 70, but no acting city council persons, no one from city government to push their interests. In addition to this, they were housed in an economic development office, but it was a place where, and they've been there 10 years now, where it was expressed to me in many interviewees that there's a disconnect between economic development and cultural development. Although we're there, they don't really quite understand what they do. They don't see why support for artists is economic development. So based on that disconnect, as well as this call for a separate arts and culture agency, there's resistance from the Economic Growth and Redevelopment Services Office to pull out a big chunk of funding from their budget and a big chunk of what they do. And so the Economic Development Office actually tried to stall them from going before City Council, and this sort of divisiveness also played a role. Another factor is the complex organization in Austin. So the Cultural Arts Division handles most of the arts and cultural programs, but you also have a series of commissions. I mentioned the Music Commission. There's also an Arts Commission, and for a time there was a Live Music Commission. You have activities in the Parks Department. You have a separate film office and music office in the Visitors Bureau. So a scattered array of activity that leads to more potential for fragmented voices for disagreement. Third key factor is what happened during the Create Austin planning process. So in some ways, very successful at creating a new cultural coalition that they wanted. But at the same time, part of the purpose of the plan was to put the arts on par with music. that music was getting so much attention in the city, and that really there's a lot more going on that deserves recognition. And so this was maybe an underlying agenda of the plan. So as the planning process went on, people in the music commission, people in the music community, I think really recognized this, and the plan almost became a source for new divisions. And you started getting a fracturing within this larger cultural community. And during the planning process, people from the music community petitioned city council to make their own plan. The Live Music Task Force went off, put together their own set of recommendations that are actually very similar to what was going on with Create Austin. The most important one to mention was they called for a separate music division away from the cultural arts division. And this plan was passed before Create Austin, and the music division was actually approved in January of 2010 before Create Austin was even approved by City Council. And they got staff to do this. So this is a diverse and divided cultural coalition. And the final factor here is recession. No doubt, 2008 to 2010 period, Austin has budget woes, $28 million budget deficit, 34% decline in development revenues, cuts to their hotel occupancy tax, which funds the cultural context program. And so the city's saying we cannot put any new funding into Create Austin. We can't support this because we're in this recessionary climate. But at the same time, I've talked about some of this resistance. You note during this time that the music division was formed in the peak of recession. So I think it's used as a sort of way of backing off from supporting the plan, because it goes beyond this image and amenities-based focus that the city's had in place for so long. So let me revisit these questions and kind of summarize where I've been going with this. Larger trends like the recessions, although they had very different effects, Richard Flores' creative class imaginary, were very important in influencing policy. But I think these are very much mediated by localized factors. So the prior economic development, the high-tech strategy, the smart growth policies that locked in this early amenities-based approach in the city, the fact that Austin is a fairly small city with a very dominant music industry clearly plays a role. The departmental organization, you had the cultural arts division within an economic development office. You had the fragmented sort of policy framework. And then the forum for interaction created by Create Austin. On the one hand, a great resource for bringing people together and potentially shifting the path of policy, but on the other hand, a fragmented coalition that ultimately emerges. And so I think this creative city concept can create a window of opportunity for arts and cultural sector groups to push the argument towards more direct representation. But because of this internal difficulty and the long established amenities-based approach, I think in Austin, at least at this point, they've ultimately have not realized that. And so I want to wrap up with a quick plug. I have a co-edited book coming out with a colleague from the University of Toronto who I believe is actually speaking here in February, called The Politics of Urban Cultural Policy. And the impetus for this book was the work I was doing in Austin and Toronto, much like what I've presented here today, as well as what my colleague was doing in Toronto and Chicago, and try to move beyond this single case study and look at a comparative study of different cultural policy experiences, look at the different contexts in which policy is made, and the different institutional dynamics, and see what kind of lessons can be gleaned from looking at cities around the world. And last but not least, what I presented here, if you're interested in reading it, it's online at the Journal of Urban Affairs. It'll be coming out in print next year at some point. Thanks.